Hello, and welcome to Science on the Radio, your home for fascinating local science. I'm Nina Morgan. This week, I've been chatting with Arianwen Herbert. She's in the first year of a PhD project at the Department of Earth Sciences at Oxford University, and she's a member of a lab group called Ocean Bug. Well, to geologists like me and Grant, Earth Sciences means geology, but the department actually takes in a lot more than that. And in talking to Arianwen, my eyes have really been opened.
Yeah, I think historically that is what it would be, and that's people's kind of impression of it. My lab is ocean biogeochemistry, so the ocean is what we study, and then we look at it from those 3 points of view. So we look at the biology of the organisms that live there, we look at the geology of what's happening in the fossil record and things, and then also kind of the chemistry and the biochemistry of everything that's going on in the sea.
So how do you get involved in this? You're not a geologist?
I am not a geologist, but I think there's a lot of interplay. It's all our world, it's all our ocean. And something that my supervisor kind of said to me is you realise when you start looking down one of those avenues, you realise that you can't really get a full picture without looking at all of them, really. There's so much interplay, there's so many different factors that you need to account for if you're going to answer the big question.
Now you've got plans.
Yeah, I've got big plans. So my work looks at the evolution and the adaptation of phytoplankton, so kind of marine microalgae, the very, very small algae that live on our oceans, and how they're adapted to the regions that they occupy in the global ocean. So in particular, I look at the subtropical gyres, which are the regions around the equator, and they're super oligotrophic. And that's a big word that just means they're very, very low in nutrients. And kind of why we're looking at this, importantly, is that these low nutrient regions are predicted to increase in size and abundance with the increasing temperature. And so we need to improve our understanding of the algae that live there, because we need to be able to make predictions about how these organisms might respond to global change. So I'm trying to understand how they react both on a physiological level and their biochemistry, how that allows them to live where they do, and what this means for the roles that they play going forward.
Okay, so plankton, they're floating organisms, aren't they?
They are. They're floating. Some of them are motile, which means that they move on their own. Some of them are non-motile. If you think about the bigger kind of seaweeds and seagrass and things, then they're normally kind of in one place, but the algae that I study, they're moving around all the time. They're very, very, very tiny microscopic organisms.
Okay, so how are phytoplankton affected by the ocean, the chemistry in the ocean?
So what we're looking at the moment is how they're affected by the changing chemistry of the ocean. So there's kind of two answers to this in terms of the increasing temperature, and then also we look at increasing carbon dioxide, and specifically anthropogenic carbon dioxide. So that means human-made and human put out rather than naturally occurring changes. So the ocean takes a huge amount of the brunt of this. I have a figure which is in my head, has never left me. Since 1971, which is kind of the rise of industrialization, the ocean has absorbed over 90% of the excess heat from climate change, which is a huge amount. And most of this is absorbed by the surface layer, which also happens to be exactly where most of the marine life lives. And this has kind of a whole host of effects that I can't possibly list them all. But with regards to microalgae, it has big impacts on their growth because lots of the reactions that happen inside their cells are temperature dependent. So because these algae are responsible for biogeochemical cycling of nutrients in our ocean, this can have huge knock-on effects. They're photosynthetic organisms, so they absorb carbon dioxide and they release oxygen that we breathe. So they're important in both of those ways. And one of the big things that we kind of don't know is that as the temperature of the oceans increase, we don't know whether primary productivity, so that just means the way that they cycle all of these elements, we don't know whether it will increase or decrease. And that's kind of crazy to think about because it's one of the most fundamental questions, right, is will it go up or down? And not only do we not have a perfect model, we can't even say which direction it's going to be in. So we really need to understand more about their metabolic processes and their growth and dynamics in order to make predictions about what might happen in the future.
Yeah. Well, if the temperature of the ocean is changing, presumably the chemistry is changing, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And this is kind of another thing that it links to temperature. It's not directly the same thing, but it's really linked, is the carbon dioxide, right? And that's the thing that actually has a huge impact on the chemistry of the ocean, because all of the carbon dioxide that we release, about somewhere between a quarter and a third of it is absorbed by our oceans again. So you're kind of getting a feel for just how much they do for us, really. And the big impact of this, or one of the big impacts, is that it causes acidification of the ocean. And this is kind of potentially something that we're hearing a lot about at the moment, but maybe we don't really understand kind of why this is an issue. So what it is when seawater absorbs carbon dioxide, it reacts with the water. A little bit of chemistry coming up here. So it forms a chemical called carbonic acid. We're into chemistry. And this carbonic acid then breaks down into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And it's actually the presence of these free hydrogen ions that decreases the pH of the ocean. So it makes it more acidic. And if you think about a neutral pH as being 7 on a scale of 1 to 14, our oceans are generally alkaline. So they sit currently at about 8.1 on average across the global ocean. But before industrialization, that kind of figure that I quoted earlier, the average pH of the ocean was 8.2. And you might be thinking, 0.1% change is not huge, but because it's a logarithmic scale, this actually represents a 30% increase in acidity. So that's huge. That has a massive knock-on effect on our marine ecosystems. Kind of one of the biggest examples being the fishing industry. So around over a third of the world population relies on fish as their main source of protein in their diets. And so any sort of effects that might have a knock-on onto that is something we need to think about. And on the scale of microalgae, which is closer to kind of my work, the actual increase in acidity in itself causes a decrease in the abundance of carbonate ions. And if you think about things like corals, and there are lots of other calcifying plankton, it means that these things can't, build their protective shells, and they can't grow, and it affects community structures. So it has a huge, again, knock-on effect because these guys are right at the bottom of the food chain and are really the web of life.
So there's potential, if the acidity keeps rising, that the whole sort of animal population of the oceans could change.
Yeah, it's a really tough one because we want to hit a fine balance between making people understand the urgency but also not scaring people and not making us feel like we're beyond change or beyond help. I think there's a lot of conversations now about tipping points, and that's a big word. What is the tipping point? When we talk about warming, is 1.5 degrees a tipping point? And I guess what's important to say is 1.5 degrees is a limit, not a target. But I think we have to be careful with these words, because just because we might hit something that we hope not to, that doesn't mean that there's not a reason to keep trying with every single thing that we have to try and, keep these things just as low as we can. So yeah, it does have the potential to have a huge knock-on effect, and it does. We're seeing these knock-on effects all the time, but hopefully if we can start kind of at the bottom, then we can really make sure that we protect these things that protect us at the end of the day.
So how do they protect us? Is it that they absorb carbon dioxide themselves, or they allow the ocean to absorb more? How does that work?
In terms of the climate, the main thing that they do is hugely buffers everything that we're doing. Everything in terms of the temperature, in terms of the carbon dioxide, the ocean takes the brunt of that, but it also, it really cuts us some slack in terms of it absorbs a lot of it, and it can take a whole lot of it. It is extremely resilient. A lot of these ecosystems are very resilient. When you look at kind of coral reefs, you get these bleaching events, but they are really able to bounce back in a wonderful way. And as long as we, moving forward, start to protect these things more, they will bounce back. I think that's one of the things to think about as well, is a lot of the things that we've done, a lot of the effects that we've had are not forever. And if we can make those actions, then we can get back to a healthier ocean and a healthier world in that way. But yeah, the oceans are just really important. They produce a huge amount of the oxygen that we breathe. They're a huge food source, as I said. And yeah, we couldn't live without them.
Well, that's really exciting, and it's nice to know that it's not total doom and gloom.
Yeah.
There is something we can do. So how are you studying this? I know you must be like a tiny part of the whole cog here in this environmental wheel, really. So what exactly are you going to be doing?
Yeah, I love that idea of the tiny cog, because I think, especially with academic research, we are all just doing one teeny tiny thing, and sometimes it's difficult to say what will the impact of your research be, but it's about what the impact of all of it will be when it comes together. So I take a few different approaches to my work, which I think is really useful, and it's one of the main things of the doctoral training partnership that I'm on. They really encourage interdisciplinarity. So I'm about 9 months into 4 years, so I'll kind of preface it with that. But thus far, I've been growing my algae in the lab, which is a lot of fun. It's one of my favourite things to do. There are a number of steps even just to this. So they come from the ocean and they get kept in culture collections, where it tends to be very sort of standardised conditions in terms of, the media they're grown in, the light intensity, the temperature. And so the first few months have basically been getting to know my algae, understanding how they really like to live, and also weaning them. They really are like children at this point. You have to wean them from natural seawater onto synthetic ocean water, which again, like children, is not a straightforward process. And then, after that, I am experimenting on them. So I'm sort of putting them under different stresses and looking at how that impacts their growth, their physiology, their biochemistry. And there are a number of ways that you can do this. So you can kind of take these measurements at the top level. So you can use proxies, like, without getting too technical, like light scattering and looking at growth rates and visual measurements. But then the hope is to also conduct some omics, which basically just means looking at a whole set of molecules, any whole set of molecules. So you can do, hopefully, proteomics, which allows you to look at all the proteins that are produced. You can do metabolomics, which allows you to look at all of the metabolites that the cells are producing. And this kind of allows you to basically peek inside the cells and see what their holistic and coordinated response is to environmental stresses, but in a controlled environment. And then I also do some bioinformatics, which is another, I guess, a bit of a buzzword, basically looking at data that has been gathered from cruises and from field sites. So cruises is scientific cruises. And sadly, yes, for the people that do that research. And you can integrate that all together actually across the global ocean, which allows you to look at patterns of distribution and abundance, and you can cross-correlate this with physical oceanographic parameters like nutrients and temperature and that sort of thing. And then finally, hopefully, with every single bone in my body crossed, my research will take me out into the field. So the ideal would be a research cruise, which I just mentioned. It's kind of what it says on the tin. These vessels are basically sea-going laboratories, and they allow you to take samples at different sites and do on-ship experiments, and also take things home to kind of isolate or look into them in a bit more detail. But this could also be done at a site on an island or near any kind of relevant coastal area. But these positions are really hard to get for a number of reasons. So I'm working hard, I'm having lots of conversations. But I guess this is a little shout out, if I may. If anyone is listening and knows of or knows anyone who might know any spaces on research cruises, please let me know, because that would just be the most wonderful experience, I think.
Oh, it does sound wonderful, not least because you've chosen a very nice part of the world to focus your research. But when you're on the cruise, what would you do? I'm assuming you will get a place.
So at the moment, what I'm thinking, because I'm looking at the nutrient use of these organisms, is you can do kind of different nutrient addition things, which seems counterintuitive if you're looking at how they survive under low nutrients. But you can see when you add these things back in, which groups suddenly thrive and which groups might not so much. I also am working on a couple of different groups of green algae, but one of the groups that I work on has never actually been isolated in culture. So people have looked at it in the oceans, and there is data around it. So I'm looking at it in the bioinformatics that I mentioned. But it would be really amazing to actually isolate these and be able to work on them in the lab, because you just get so much more of an insight into how they actually work and how important they really are. And we think they're very important. So, yeah.
Oh, it just sounds fascinating. So when you collected this information, how will you relate it to things like climate change and changes in ocean chemistry and all that sort of stuff?
I think this goes back to the cog in a wheel. It's not necessarily a direct relation, but if we can understand better how these algae are reacting to specific changes that we make that can mimic things that might happen as the climate changes, then we can make predictions, and we can add all of this data into things like models, and I don't know if this is also a bit of a buzzword, but we have more things like called digital twins now. So you can have a digital twin of something like the ocean, and you can put different parameters in and see how it changes. I don't know a huge amount about that, but I imagine that that's what this sort of data might be useful for. So yeah, it's about understanding on the very small scale what's going on and adding that into these huge global efforts to get the bigger picture.
Well, digital twins, that's a new one on me. But I suppose when you're starting any kind of research, you have to do loads and loads of background research.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the things that you don't expect maybe when you start a PhD. You think, right, I've got this idea, it's going to be amazing, it's going to save the world, and I'm going to do it right now. But the reality is, for anybody out there who might be thinking about what it's really like to do a PhD or whether they might consider it, then the first few months are really reading and reading and reading, especially if you make a field switch like I did. So I was working in a marine environmental microbiology lab, but I was working on a very different thing to what I do now. And so, yeah, that's, I guess, a word to the wise is if you're going to do something like that, you are going to have to dedicate a lot of time to reading. But it's a really nice opportunity because as well as reading, you can do a lot of writing. I think it's a really good way of thinking about and kind of framing things in a way that they will be useful for you. So a lot of research projects need to start with a literature review, for example, and that's what I've been working on over the last few months. But also it's just one of the best things. When in your life do you get the opportunity to sit down for months and read about the thing that you're most interested in the world? It's a privilege, really, and I've had a great time kind of getting to know the field and yeah.
Wow, well, that just sounds like a dream in our busy lives to be able to focus in on something like that. It's kind of funny in Oxford, it's about as far away from the sea as you can get.
I know. I get this all the time because I was working in a marine environmental microbiology lab in Warwick as well, which is the most landlocked city in the UK. And Oxford is not far off that. So this is a question I get all the time. And I guess, we're not that far from kind of Plymouth and Southampton. Every now and then we have to pick somebody to make the sacrificial trip to get more seawater for us. But yeah, when you're working in the lab and when you're working on data that comes in remotely, it's not too bad. However, I do wish that I lived right by the sea. I do.
Oh, well, what got you interested in ocean stuff?
For me, I think I've always been interested in the ocean, and this is another thing everyone says to me when I say I'm a marine biologist. They say, oh, well, didn't we all want to be a marine biologist when we were a child, and now you've actually gone and done it? So I think I've always just had a love of the ocean. I love diving and snorkeling and swimming, and, just being in it and being near it is such a wonderful feeling for me. Then I went off and I did my biochemistry degree, and I thought, okay, I will do some serious science now. And then I ended up back in marine biology, and I was just so happy that I could be really doing what I wanted to do, because I love microbiology. I love being able to mess with things in the lab and seeing what they do. And so a marine biology career in maybe what you'd think of more typically like dolphins and big animals was something I was always interested in, but I was really interested in the small scale science. And so now this has kind of allowed me to do both of those things, which is really cool. I also just had the most wonderful lab in my third and fourth years of my undergraduate degree. So I started university in 2019. Obviously, we were all at home by 2020, and that was tough because it was a pretty hands-on degree, and the lab stuff was the stuff that I loved. And so as soon as I went into my third year and we were all allowed kind of back, I joined a lab. And I ended up staying with them for the next 2 years because I had the most wonderful time, had the most inspiring supervisors, fantastic mentors. The culture was wonderful. I learned so much. And I think from there, it was just the natural next step was just to keep going in that sort of environment. And I really couldn't see myself doing anything else now.
Wow. It just sounds like a dream career you're starting. It sounds great.
Yeah, I do feel so lucky every day. And people do laugh at me for saying that, but it's a bit of a pinch me, I think, definitely doing this here.
To find out more about Arianwen and her work, the best place to start is her webpage. That's www.earth.ox.ac.uk/people/Arianwen-Herbert. You'll also find her on Instagram and TikTok on @ScienceForMyMum. That's all one word. We'll include all these addresses on our webpage. To find out more about inspiring local science and scientists and to listen back to any of our past programs, just visit www.wrfm.co.uk/on-air/podcasts and follow the links to Science on the Radio.